Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture Lecture Series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
I'm Philip Emeagwali. The internet has many fathers and mothers, as well as aunts and uncles, that did not invent a new internet. The father of the internet should at least invent a new internet. I am called a father of the internet because I am the only father of the internet that invented a new internet. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I was the first person to discover how to parallel process real-world problems and how to do so across millions upon millions of processors that were tightly coupled to each other. In parallel supercomputing across my new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical to each other. The most important knowledge is to fully understand how to control and harness every processor that was within my global network of processors. Each processor operated its own operating system. In 1989, I made the news headlines when I recorded the maximum possible speed increase across my ensemble of 65,536 commodity off-the-shelf processors. That parallel processed speed increase of a factor of 65,536 that was then considered impossible led to my discovery that parallel supercomputing will be the vital technology that will make computers faster and make supercomputers fastest. I discovered practical parallel supercomputing and did so by making a one-to-one corresponded and metaphorical mapping, and doing so from the vertices of the hypercube to each processor, and by making another one-to-one corresponded mapping from the bidirectional edges of the hypercube to my email wires. Unlike your cube, my hypercube was defined in 16-dimensional hyperspace and therefore has 2 raised to power 16 or 64 binary thousand vertices and 16 times as many or 1 binary million bidirectional edges. Programming 64 binary thousand tightly coupled processors to work together to forecast the weather was in the realm of science fiction and would have been dismissed as an act of insanity, and dismissed when I began programming supercomputers back on June 20, 1974 at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States. But on the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I discovered how to turn that science fiction into non-fiction that is used to forecast the weather for your evening news. As the first person to make the news headlines for discovering practical parallel supercomputing, I visualized the vertices and the edges of a hypercube that were etched onto the surface of my hypersphere. I invented the Philip Emeagwali internet as corresponding to the cut-out silhouette that was my topological metaphor for the appearance of my new internet that has a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical to each other and that were tightly coupled to each other. That new supercomputer and the new internet were like tightly conjoined twins with only one superbrain. In 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered practical parallel supercomputing and invented it as the vital technology that now underpins every supercomputer and that enabled me to compute faster and across my new internet and to compute faster than any supercomputer that ever existed. I envisioned my new virtual supercomputer as my new internet. My first visions of my new internet began as a dark shape and as an outline of a blank global network of processors that were connected with email wires, that were empty messages. That dark shape of my new internet remained visible inside my mind. It's impossible for me to walk alone and program that new internet and do so without intellectually seeing the exact positions in 16-dimensional space of each of my 65,536 processors. It's also impossible for me to send and receive email messages across my 1,048,576 bidirectional email wires and do so correctly without knowing in advance the exact positions in hyperspace of my 65,536 processors. As the first parallel supercomputer scientist, I was not trying to see with my naked eyes any of my 65,536 processors or any of my 1,048,576 bidirectional email wires that married my commodity processors together and did so to form a new internet that tightly circumscribed a globe in 16-dimensional hyperspace. In contrast, I only saw my new supercomputer and my new internet inside my mind, not with my naked eyes, as was often presumed. In a sense, I saw my new internet in its entirety, the way you saw our planet Earth in its entirety, and understood that it is not flat, and do so with your mind, not by encircling it around the Earth in a spacecraft. I visualized how to email my 65,536 computer codes, as well as email as many sets of data that I used at the mathematical physics core of my initial boundary value problems. That was how I preloaded each of my 65,536 processors. I visualized how to continuously pump my email messages across my new internet. I visualized each of my email messages as having 5 subject lines and having no message body, and as traversing across my new global network of 1,048,576 email wires that outlined my new internet. In my mind, I sketched my silhouette as the dark shadow of a new internet that encircles the earth. That shadow was created by the sun. The partial differential equations that I invented are the most advanced expressions in calculus. Those partial differential equations are far more abstract than the quadratic equation, and for that reason, the layperson cannot scribble them across the blackboard or solve them on or across motherboards. The system of 9 partial differential equations that I invented are abstract and are de facto invincible. However, I use those partial differential equations as my extreme scaled computational test beds for inventing a new computer, a new supercomputer, and a new internet. In the lecture series of my contributions to mathematics that I posted on Emeagwali on youtube.com/Emeagwali, I described in prose, rather than in abstract mathematics, how I coded my initial boundary value problem that we are governed by a system of partial differential equations of calculus. And I did so differently. I did not code my initial boundary value problem for only one processor, as was done by other computational mathematicians. I paradigm shifted by parallel supercomputing my initial boundary value problem, and doing so across a new internet that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. That solitary act of repetitive coding for each processor that defined and outlined that new internet was my form of meditation. The very essence of my ensemble of processors was to use emails to weave together my new global network of 64 binary thousand processors and to invent a new internet that is one whole cohesive virtual supercomputer that is not a computer per se. In my mind, those 64 binary thousand slowest processors were de facto the fastest supercomputer. That was my metaphor for a futuristic, thought-provoking, and poetic internet. That is, I rethought my new computer as my new internet and vice versa. I visualize my email messages as traversing across the interior of the 16-dimensional hyperspace and along the bidirectional edges of the hypercube in that hyperspace. I gave form to that ensemble and gave form to it as a never before seen internet. For me, that new global network of processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, and that shared nothing between each other, became a mathematicized and abstracted internet that is a singular virtual supercomputer. I was in the news in 1989 and thereafter because I was the first person to parallel process across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that shared nothing between them. I was the first person to theoretically discover that no upper limit exists when parallel supercomputing across an infinite number of processors. Put differently, my inspiration is this: the science fiction of planetary parallel supercomputing across the entire internet that encircled planet Earth could become the non-fiction of our descendants. I was the first person to discover how to parallel process across a new internet that I visualized as a small copy of the planet-sized internet. For that invention that was conceived back in 1974 and completed in 1989, whenever the phrase "father of the internet" is mentioned, the first name that Google suggests is Philip Emeagwali. The contributions to the development of the computer that are the subject of school reports are inventions that are paradigm shifting or that change the way we look at the computer. The objective criterion for measuring contributions to the development of the computer is fixed, namely the fastest computation that was executed by any means necessary. My fastest computation that I discovered on the 4th of July 1989 was executed by parallel supercomputing a grand challenge initial boundary value problem of extreme scale computational physics and solving it across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were identical to each other, that were equal distances apart from each other, but that shared nothing between each other. My scientific discovery that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 was that parallel processing will become the vital technology that will make the modern supercomputer super. That discovery made the news headlines because it will change the way we look at the computer. I discovered that we should look at the modern computer not as a computing machinery per se, but as a new internet de facto. That never before seen internet derives its supercomputer horsepower by parallel processing its computational workload across its millions of processors that were tightly coupled to each other, with each processor operating its own operating system. For me, Philip Emeagwali, that technological breakthrough in massively parallel processing was the supercomputer news headlines that crossed the sea from San Francisco, California to Onitsha, Nigeria, and crossed the sea because it broke new grounds of supercomputing across 65,536 tightly coupled processors that equidistantly encircled a globe that defined and outlined a new internet. Back on June 20, 1974, at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States, I began programming the first computer to be rated at 1 million instructions per second. The first supercomputer was invented in 1946. That first supercomputer was 100 feet long, 10 feet wide, 10 feet tall, and 3 feet deep. So supercomputers were programmed for 28 years before I began to do so. But those supercomputers only solved one problem at a time instead of solving a billion problems at once. But at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I became the first person to discover practical parallel supercomputing. That discovery made the news headlines because it was said to be impossible to parallel process a grand challenge problem and do so across a new internet that is a new global network of unlimited number of processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. The grand challenge problems solved on supercomputers remain essentially the same, but the value and size of the supercomputer market has grown from $7 million back in 1946 to $20 billion a year, or a factor of 3,000. The information technology market is $5 trillion, with more than 40% of that market in North America, primarily in the United States, where nearly 2 million skilled persons are employed in the IT sector. The supercomputer that Japan has on its drawing board will cost $1.25 billion. As a massively parallel supercomputer scientist that came of age in the 1970s and 80s, I walked and walked alone because I took the road less traveled. But I also got noticed more because I did my parallel supercomputer research under unusual circumstances that took me from Onitsha to Oregon back on March 23, 1974. In the 1970s and 80s, no sub-Saharan African-born scientific researcher was hired by any of the numerous US nuclear research laboratories where most supercomputing research was conducted. In 1989, I discovered that a grand challenge problem can be divided into millions of smaller, less challenging problems, and then I further discovered that I could use as many email messages to puzzle together those small problems into the original grand challenge problem that I could then solve across my new internet, that is my new global network of as many processors that each operated its own operating system and that each shared nothing with other nearest neighboring processors. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered how the slowest processors can be parallel processed and harnessed to solve once impossible to solve problems and solve them at previously impossible speeds. My discovery created a need for the parallel supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing made the news headlines because it was akin to discovering an undiscovered continent of the unknown world of the new computer and the new internet.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.